Hi, I appreciate being here today. I know that we're doing this presentation virtual this year, so I hope to share some important information with you. My name is Juan Armijo. I live in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I am a social studies teacher at Mayfield High School in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and I want to welcome you to the presentation. One of my interests over the years regarding the Second World War has been the contributions of my state and the contributions of Hispanics, Latinos in the Second World War. One topic that I thought might be important to discuss this year is the role of immigrants in the Second World War, in particular from Mexico. What I'm going to talk about today is the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement, also more popularly known as the Bracero Agreement, which was agreed to between the United States and Mexico on August 4th, 1942, by an executive order. This is a very common picture that has been taken, a photo of a bracero worker. This one was taken in the 1940s with his short hoe, which we'll talk about. We're going to see a little short video about that. President Roosevelt, FDR, had an important quote that I have found in a number of places in doing my research on the Bracero Program. Mexican farm workers brought to the United States in accordance with the agreement between our two governments are contributing their toil to the production of vitally needed food. That was in August 1942. In his State of the Union, Franklin Roosevelt said, "We have withdrawn from the labor force in the farms some 5 million of our younger workers. And in spite of this, our farmers have contributed their share to the common effort by producing the greatest quantity of food ever made available during a single year in all our history." This is an important quote, State of the Union quote, and there's also a photo here where you see braceros arriving via train into the induction point. The primary induction point was via Ciudad Juarez in El Paso, Texas. I live 30 minutes from El Paso, Texas. Las Cruces, New Mexico is just north of the border with Texas and Mexico. This is a common World War II victory poster that was associated with the relationship between Mexico and the United States and the braceros. It says, "Americanos todos, luchamos por la victoria." Americans all, let's fight for the victory. It shows the arm there of Uncle Sam with the cap, and then a Mexican sombrero with a very typical Mexican jacket. And so it was meant as being a together fighting for victory. Before I start getting into some information about braceros, I thought it's important to talk about what bracero means. And a bracero means it's taken from the word brazo, el brazo, the arm, and it's an individual who uses their arm to work for labor. And the braceros came from small towns, villages all over Mexico. A person who works with this arm, I'm taking a quote from somebody, a very common feature was being bent over with a little short hoe. This hoe is called a Cortito. I'm going to show you a little video about that. In any field, anywhere from 8 to 14 hours a day. Very back-breaking labor, literally. What's interesting is the short hoe is viewed as not a friendly work tool. The other day, a field right across from my house here, I saw a number of what are modern-day braceros, workers that come over from Mexico on H-2A, working in a field just right across from my house, and some of them had some very similar little hoes. So it has not disappeared. The definition for bracero from one of the online dictionaries I pulled is the noun that's a temporary Mexican labor. Mexican workers allowed entry in the United States to work for a limited time, typically on a farm. And then they mention arm. Okay, but it's important to associate the term bracero with a laborer, worker who uses their arm. So a little bit of background about the Bracero Program. And so one thing that I think is interesting, I'll probably interject a few personal things. The other day, I was talking to one of my best friends. I've been best friends with him since the 7th grade, which is many years. And his father, who I knew, and both his parents, his father, when I knew them, his father had, for medical reasons, just left and retired working for a large pecan producer here in the Mesilla Valley called Stallman Farms. And my friend lived as a young kid on Stallman Farms in some of the worker housing. And and over the years, we've talked about different things in his family, but one thing that we've really never talked about was he asked me what I was doing, and I just happened that time I was working on the presentation. I'm working on this presentation that I'm doing on the Bracero Program. He goes, did you know that my father was a Bracero? He came to the United States during World War II as a Bracero. I had no idea. He had never mentioned that. He said that his father first arrived in Mexico during the Second World War as a Bracero, working in El Paso and in New Mexico. So one of the legacies, of course, is that there are millions of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Braceros living in the United States, many of them very successful. And this is something that my friend had never mentioned, the term that his father had come in through Bracero. He talked about how his father and his mother both mentioned the importance of whatever living conditions that they had been given before he married his mother, and afterwards. He said whatever living conditions you were given as a farm laborer, you took pride in where you lived, you made sure your house was clean, and you never looked back. So something new that I learned about somebody that I talk to every day and have talked to every day for many decades. So the Bracero Program, as I mentioned, was created through an executive order and an executive agreement between the United States and Mexico, and it created an agriculture and railroad guest worker program. Mexico declared war on the Axis powers in 1942. The part of their contribution to the war effort in 1942 was providing work and laborers to the United States. Agriculture during economic crisis and war has always been deemed essential. During our current pandemic, the president has declared agriculture essential. As a matter of fact, when some of these meatpacking plants where COVID-19 started spreading, he did not allow them to close, said they had to bring in workers. And so it's always been deemed an essential industry. Labor shortages existed during the Second World War in the typically low-paying agriculture sector because many of the workers either, one, went to war, or two, they went to work in the defense production industry, and three, one of the big elements, in particular in New Mexico and California, was the internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans. These were U.S. citizens and non-citizens, but many of these Japanese Americans were farm workers and worked in the fields, particularly in the Central Valleys in California, and here where I grew up in the Mesilla Valley, there were a number of Japanese American farm families, and this caused a labor shortage. And these, of course, if we just on a side note, the Japanese Americans were put in internment camps as a result of Executive Order 9066. So what this did is this created a big farm labor shortage. So the United States and Mexico agreed to create the Bracero Program, where in cooperation with farmers, large farmers, agriculture corporations, contracts would be issued to farm workers to come over and work in the United States. The original intent of the program was that it would go through the Second World War, but Congress extended it a number of times, and it didn't really officially end until December 31st, 1964, with all the controversy in between, immigration issues, etc. But it ended up being a very long-lasting program, and there's a current version of it today. Here's a timeline of the Bracero Program. You can see World War II, the wartime agreement lasted through 45. Congress passed laws in 46, 47, 48. In 48 through 51, the Truman administration had administrative agreements with Mexico. And then in 51 through 1964, Congress passed another law that created the Bracero Program again. So it had been enacted at various times through presidential executive order and public law through Congress. Agriculture contracts with individuals coming up from Mexico were spread eventually over 24 states. The initial emphasis was in the American Southwest, in California, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The primary entrance processing center was in El Paso, Texas, just south of me. A lot of the braceros came in through Ciudad Juarez, which is the city that's adjacent, right across the Rio Grande from the Mexico, and borders both El Paso, Texas, and borders my state, New Mexico. Men were guaranteed safe living conditions, access to food. For some men it was provided. For some men there were commissaries set up. I found a story of a farm just south of me where the two farmers, who I knew both of the farmers, they are no longer alive. Their children are alive and farm, but they had among the braceros who worked for them, a low-price commissary with a lot of staples like beans and bologna, things like that. The high wage was a wage of 30 cents an hour. As part of the agreement to come to work in the United States, some of their savings was sent directly and put in savings in Mexico. This was a controversy in itself because many of them did not ever see that savings that was sent to Mexico that was kept by the Mexican government. It was to be used for their family and for future use. As part of the agreement, becoming a bracero, they were not conscripted into the military in Mexico. As part of and it was considered a wartime job, part of the war effort for Mexico and for the braceros. Eventually, through the process, there were 5 million men who worked via contracts that were awarded through the farmers, the agriculture corporations, by the federal government. These contracts went to the individuals, and then the federal government had agreements with all these large farms, corporations, even small farmers had braceros working for them. This was a picture that I found at a processing center in El Paso, where the braceros came in, provided information. Not all the men who applied to be braceros were accepted into the program. A lot of men were actually rejected to come across, but they came in and they provided names, information, things like that. One of the controversies of the program was the use of DDT. The National Museum of American History has this photo that showing braceros arriving. It says, on arrival, United States officials took braceros to processing centers, searched them for weapons, marijuana, or other contraband, and sprayed them with DDT. What's interesting is in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, some of the other famous photos of people being sprayed with DDT comes from prisons in the United States. Of course, we know DDT was banned as a substance, especially after that famous book by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, showed the dangers of DDT as an insecticide that's banned. But this is a photo taken from the National Museum of American History where they're being sprayed to make sure that they weren't polluted with bugs, I guess. The photographer Leonard Nadell captioned this photograph much in the same manner that was used in handling livestock on crossing over the bridge from Mexico. This picture was taken at Hidalgo in South Texas. The men were herded to groups into 100 through a makeshift booth and sprayed with the DDT. There was a lot of issues of discrimination against braceros, and there were some examples of it. When I show you the resources, I'm going to show you an example. sort of a de novo look at some of the braceros of some recent oral histories. But the braceros were guaranteed protection against discrimination and segregation, which was not always the case. During the Second World War, the program was pulled from Texas by Mexico because there were a lot of incidents of abuse, maltreatment, some lynching of braceros at the border, discrimination, and violence. And so during the Second World War, Mexico also prohibited braceros from working in Texas. The governor of Texas at that time made a lot of personal appeals to Mexico to allow them to come. He promised protection, but the Mexican government took them a number of years before they would allow braceros into Texas. This 10% that I held, that was held in savings account, a lot of braceros never saw the 10%. There was a lot of corruptness in the Mexican government, and there were a lot of lawsuits on both sides of the border for many years in U.S. federal courts and in Mexican courts to try and settle the 10%. And for the most part, braceros lost the lawsuits. And in some places, many of the braceros experienced inadequate living conditions and access to food. I remember when I was a kid, I saw there were some bracero dormitories on a highway here, Highway 28, that no longer are there, that braceros used to live in. A small number of the braceros also worked on the railroads. That was part of the executive agreement. A lot of the rail workers went into war. A lot of the men went into war in the military during the Second World War. Also, there were a lot of Japanese that worked in the railroad laborers, and there were a lot of Chinese immigrants who had been forced back to China who had worked in the railroad industry. And this is from 1944, an ID card that I thought was interesting. This was a bracero who worked in the railroad. He also was, under federal law, afforded benefits on the Railroad Retirement Board. His name was Aaron Gamez Castañeda, and he was a citizen of Mexico. I hope he got his railroad benefits. He entered through El Paso, Texas, with the primary contract assignment of working in the railroad industry. Some of the things that I found interesting when I was looking at the story, I found two things that I think are really good resources. Down the road from me, about 20 minutes in La Mesa, New Mexico, there's a restaurant that's open today that's called Chope's Bar and Cafe. And I found this, and I never realized, but in the owner, Jose Benavides, and his wife, in the 1940s, his little restaurant in La Mesa, New Mexico, which is still open, was a central place where many of the braceros that worked in the Mesilla Valley would go to have a drink, to eat food, chili rellenos, burritos, things like that. They talked about this. The restaurant looked like that back then. Here's today. He would have special plates for the bracero workers, $1 or $2 a plate. This was a good article that could be used in a class as a text-based evidence. And Jose Benavides and his wife. This is Stallman Farms. It's a pecan orchard. It's the largest in the United States. It's just south of me. But he hosted many of the braceros eating in his dining rooms at his restaurant in the 1940s. It was a place where they would go. They could speak Spanish. They could meet other braceros and have a good time. But I thought it was interesting that the Chope, Jose Benavides, if the plates would cost $1 or $2, but if the worker was short on cash, he would barter with any leftover produce they would bring. So he didn't have a problem doing that. There's a picture of him. So I thought that was an interesting article I found about localness about that. I also found something interesting. The county next to me is Luna County. And Luna County, the county seat is a city named Deming. And in the 1940s, braceros have been credited with a couple things in Luna County. They were credited with the tilling of the land and the growth of agriculture in Luna County. Luna County, we live in the desert here, and Luna County was a desert, and a lot of the Braceros came in to grow the agriculture program in Luna County and help develop and prepare and till the land, which is still to this day used for farming. The other thing is, a lot of the Braceros came back and lived in Luna County. Some of them stayed, and they changed the demographic makeup of Luna County. Luna County was about 20% Hispanic back in the 1940s, 1950s. Today, Luna County is about 65% Hispanic.
A southwestern community surrounded by desert plants and produce fields. In the dusty area of Luna County, cross-border relations have always been a part of the community.
They came in the main from little towns and little villages all over Mexico. Braceros, a person works with his arms.
In 1942, the United States and Mexico created the Bracero Program. The program was a way for millions of Mexican immigrants to come to the U.S. to work in the fields to help meet food supply demands during World War II. The immigrants worked in several different states, including New Mexico. Raymond Cobos translated for many of them.
Being bent over with a little short hoe, they call it Cortito, in a field anywhere from 8 to 12, 14 hours a day it's backbreaking labor, literally.
While some of the workers went back to their homes in Mexico, several of them stayed.
A lot of them were so well liked and did such wonderful jobs. They went back to places they had worked before. And frequently those places became sponsors.
The Bracero program brought 4.6 million Mexican farm workers into the United States, which changed immigration in Luna County significantly.
A lot of the pillars of this community came from Bracero roots. The farms and ranches ended up with workers that have stayed with them.
In 1980, 1/3 of the population in Luna County was Hispanic. Today, it's more than half.
If it wasn't for minorities moving there and having kids, that the county as a whole would have lost population.
Some credit the demographic changes to Braceros, but the program came with a lot of controversy. Low wages, labor exploitation, and Americans worried their jobs would get taken caused it to end in 1964. Now many question whether bringing it back would help our immigration problem today.
I think it would solve a lot of the problems we got right now.
Luna County Republicans know we need the labor and believe a worker program similar to the Bracero program would help with the surge of migrants we're seeing at the border.
That's why most of them are coming, because they want the economic help. They can raise the money and earn the money here in the United States, and it'll go a lot farther in Central America or wherever than it is here.
While the Bracero program changed Luna County, it's a change that many in the area embrace.
I don't see any difference in the way the community functions or the way it operates. It's just it's the same community. It does the same things that went on before, still go on now.
Those who lived through the Bracero era and those who didn't agree that this is a part of history that deserves to be revisited and that a new labor program would be worth welcoming.
Those are the heroes. Those are the ones that really worked very, very hard to build something here.
Reporting in Luna County, Marissa Armas, KOAT Action 7 News.
So when you're teaching about the Braceros, you can find a lot of resource locally. So those were two examples of local New Mexico resources that I found. And then when I was going through, what was interesting, I found a third example that I could use as a local example. I found this a professor in New York who had a blog, had written about Braceros, and he actually has written about an interview with a Bracero named Carlos Sanchez, and he was his own little oral history where the guy describes his work, and online he has the actual interview with the Bracero, asking him questions about working, how he felt, asked him about food, etc. This was an oral history project that they made, a social history, but it's an oral history. And so these kind of things I have found all over the place from different states. Many colleges, universities, researchers are putting them all together. So those are some good examples of things. Another thing I mentioned earlier was the short hoe, the Cortito, which in itself is controversial because it is a back-breaking tool. And these two guys who were part of the Bracero Legacy Project, which has a huge presence on Facebook, they talk about it, and I just thought it was a great video, so I'm going to play it. It's a real short video.
The Cortito basically signifies the hardest work done by braceros during the Bracero program. This is the tool that my grandfather arrived to work with when he arrived as a contractor at Bracero. Basically, they handed him a short handle hoe like this, and it signifies all of the labor, the toil, the sweat that braceros did to change the landscape, to thin lettuce out in the Salinas Valley, different parts of California, the Southwest.
See, the Cortito, I used it in the Mexican labor agreement sculpture I made when I first started doing the research for this. Nacho Reed did a really good explanation. When we met him, he showed us a Cortito and said, this was my grandfather's tool. Then he showed us a knife and said, this was my mother's tool. And then he showed me an air book and said, this is my tool. I immediately looked at this machine, this instrument, this technology, and said, this is the technology that took all these Mexicanos out of poverty. Of course, it broke their back. I don't want to say that what hard work and what sacrifice doesn't break your back. But at the end, this symbolizes the strength of the farm worker. Of course, it is the tool that was outlawed, but the Cortito is basically the tool for social climbing, social mobility. Like Cortitoing your way out of poverty in Mexico, man.
All right, what's the legacy? Many of the braceros ended up staying, relocating to the United States. Today in the United States, especially from California through the American Southwest and Texas, there are millions of children, grandchildren of braceros, very successful parts of the American community. We do have today what's the modern day Bracero program, the H-2A, Temporary Agricultural Worker Program, is the successor. It provides agriculture workers from Mexico to guarantee an essential food supply. Just, I believe, last week during this COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis, the president issued an executive order restricting certain job immigration classifications in order to, what he said, provide jobs for Americans seeking employment. The one program that was not included that is still open for foreign workers from Mexico is the H-2A. So that is not part of it. So it's an active program that still exists. I've included that you'll have access to a number of resources that you can use in the classroom. On Facebook, the Bracero Legacy Project is a pretty big program. I'm not going to go to the links for time's sake. The Bittersweet Harvest was a Smithsonian exhibit for a number of years that is now online. There is a wonderful video, Forgotten Voices, to show things from the National Museum of American History. I mentioned earlier there's a video here by Dr. Ignacio Nelas Rodriguez visualizing the essential Mexicans in the U.S. agricultural workforce. His video is interesting. The first part, he describes some oral histories that he did recently and the experience of his grandfather as a bracero, and he talks about some of the positive elements that he's discovered about braceros that he thinks are worthwhile exploring. He acknowledges some of the abuse, some of the labor issues, some of the complaints about braceros, but what he talks about is some of the positive things that he learned growing up about from his family with his grandfather and the braceros. So it's a worthwhile video looking at. Searching for the Bracero Legacy, California has a lot of teaching resources. There's an excellent video, a student who was the national finalist for National History Day, did a story on the braceros that's about 9 minutes, great video. The Oregon PBS did a wonderful documentary that can be shown in the classroom or put in an online class. Library of Congress has a good teaching materials. The University of New Mexico has a number of K through 12 educator guides. The Farm Workers Organization, and then there's a Bracero archive that's been developed with it. I want to thank you for allowing me to present about the Bracero program. I think that as we talk about the importance of workers in agriculture, there is a shortage. It's a reality. I've grown up, I live on a farm, I've grown up and I've seen the worker shortage, so Bracero type programs are important to the food supply of the United States. I want to thank you for participating and watching my presentation, participating in the Friends of World War II Memorial Teacher Conference. It's an important organization. I thought I'd end just showing this is my grandfather, Albert Armijo, Albuquerque, New Mexico. He served in the Second World War in the Army. This is a photo that was taken of him, I believe in 1945 in Germany, if I remember what he said, in his unit. And I think it's interesting that he's making something there on a dresser that must have been found somewhere. So he served in the European theater through 1946. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and have a wonderful virtual time at this conference.